June 14, 2024, the day the map changed forever. Let me tell you something most people missed. On June 14, the Russian Ministry of Defense released what it called the final territorial configuration of Ukraine. Not a proposal. Not a negotiating position. A final map. The kind of document you only publish when you're done talking and ready to act. The Western press barely noticed. The White House dismissed it as propaganda. But I've been studying war and geopolitics for over 50 years, first as a soldier, then as a scholar, and when a nuclear-armed great power draws a line in the sand like this, you don't ignore it. You study it. Because what happened that day wasn't just about Ukraine. It was about the end of one world order and the birth of another. And here's the part they don't want you to: Russia isn't bluffing. Now, let's start with what they told you. The official narrative goes something like: Russia is desperate, its army is collapsing, and this final map is just another propaganda stunt to save face. The Ukrainians, we're assured, will never accept it. The West will never recognize it. And even if Moscow tries to enforce it, the brave Ukrainian resistance, backed by NATO weapons and American intelligence, will push the Russians back to the 1991 borders. Case closed. The evidence? Well, there's the Ukrainian counteroffensive last summer, which did retake some territory. There's the $60 billion aid package Congress finally approved in April. There's President Zelensky's defiant speeches, vowing to fight until every inch is liberated. And then there's the Russian economy, sanctioned, isolated, supposedly on the brink. If you only read the headlines, you'd think this was a war Russia was losing, a war it had to lose. But there's a problem with this narrative. A big one. Because the data doesn't support it. Let's start with the military reality. The Ukrainian counteroffensive last year? It failed. Spectacularly. Not because Ukrainian soldiers aren't brave, they are, but because modern warfare has changed. The Russians learned from their early mistakes. They dug in. They built layered defenses. They used drones, electronic warfare, and massed artillery to turn the battlefield into a meat grinder. And the Ukrainians? They ran out of men. Not just soldiers, men. Ukraine has lost between 70,000 and 120,000 dead, depending on whose estimates you believe. That's a demographic catastrophe for a country of 36 million. And the West? We sent them just enough weapons to keep fighting, but never enough to win. Why? Because no one in Washington actually wants Ukraine to win. They want it to bleed, to weaken Russia, to justify NATO action, to sell arms. But they don't want a Ukrainian victory, because that would mean admitting this war was never winnable in the first place. Now, let's talk about that final map. The Russians aren't just claiming Donbass anymore. They're taking Kherson, Zaporizhia, Kharkiv, and most critically, Odessa. That's the entire Black Sea coast. Why? Because Odessa isn't just a port. It's the key to Russia's survival as a great power. Without it, Russia is landlocked in Europe. With it, they control the Black Sea, dominate the grain trade, and project power into the Mediterranean. This isn't about imperial nostalgia. It's about geopolitics. And if you think Putin is going to give that up because the West imposes another round of sanctions, you haven't been paying attention. But here's where it gets interesting. The Russians aren't just drawing lines on a map. They're enforcing them. Right now, as we speak, Russian forces are methodically grinding down Ukrainian defenses in the east. They're not racing for Kiev anymore. They don't need to. They're taking territory slowly, deliberately, in a way that maximizes Ukrainian casualties while minimizing their own. And the West? We're sending just enough aid to keep the Ukrainians fighting, but not enough to actually change the outcome. It's a cynical game, and the Ukrainians are the ones paying the price. Now, let's out. Because this isn't just about Ukraine. It's about the end of the American century. For 30 years, the United States has acted as if it could reshape the world in its own image. We invaded Iraq. We bombed Libya. We exited NATO right up to Russia's borders. We told ourselves that democracy and free markets would spread like wildfire, that history had ended, that we were the indispensable nation. But history didn't end. It just took a nap. And now it's back with a vengeance. Russia isn't fighting this war alone. China is watching. India is watching. The global south is watching. And what they see is a United States that can't even win a proxy war against a country with a GDP smaller than Italy's. They see a West that talks about rules-based order but only enforces the rules when it suits them. They see a superpower that's overstretched, divided, and frankly exhausted. And that's the real danger here. Because when great powers start losing wars, they don't go quietly. They double down. They escalate. They look for scapegoats. And right now, the hawks in Washington are itching for a fight not just with Russia, but with China. They're pushing for NATO troops in Ukraine. They're talking about decapitation strikes on Moscow. They're acting like this is a video game, where you can just hit reset if things go wrong. But war isn't a video game. It's a meat grinder. And if we're not careful, we're going to find out the hard way. I'm not saying Russia is the good guy here. I'm saying that in the game of great power politics, there are no good guys. There are only interests. And right now, Russia's interest is they want a buffer. They want security. They want to be treated as an equal, not as a defeated power. And if we refuse to acknowledge that, we're not just risking a wider war, we're guaranteeing one. Now, let's talk about what happens then, because this isn't just about maps. It's about the future of the world order. Scenario: the frozen conflict. In this scenario, the war grinds to a stalemate. The Russians take what they want: Donbass, Kherson, Zaporizhia, maybe even Odessa, and then dig in. The Ukrainians, exhausted and out of men, are forced to accept a ceasefire. The West saves face by calling it a temporary pause in the fighting, but everyone knows it's permanent. Ukraine becomes a rump state, dependent on Western aid, with a frozen conflict on its eastern border. It's not a victory for anyone, but it's the least bad option. Scenario: the Great Partition. This is the most likely outcome. The Russians take the east and south, the Ukrainians hold the west, and the country is effectively split in two. The West recognizes the new borders reluctantly but refuses to acknowledge Russian annexation. The war becomes a low-intensity conflict, like Korea or Cyprus. The Ukrainians get just enough aid to keep fighting, but not enough to win. The Russians get their buffer. And the world moves on until the next crisis. Scenario: the wider war. This is the nightmare scenario. The West, desperate to avoid defeat, sends NATO troops into Ukraine. The Russians, seeing this as an existential threat, escalate. Maybe they hit a NATO supply depot. Maybe they use a tactical nuke. Maybe they just keep pushing west, taking Kiev and installing a puppet government. Either way, we're in World War III. And this time, it's not just Ukraine on the line. It's the future of Europe. It's the future of the world. Now, I know it's not 1991. It's 2024. And the world has changed. So what should we do? First, we need to stop pretending this war is about democracy. It's not. It's about power. Second, we need to accept that Ukraine is not a NATO member, and it never will be. Third, we need to start negotiating not from a position of weakness, but from a position of strength. Because the alternative is unthinkable. Let me tell you something I learned in the best way to win a war is to avoid fighting it in the first place. And right now, we're sleepwalking into a conflict we can't win, with consequences we can't even imagine. The Russians have drawn their line in the sand. The question: will we have the wisdom to step back from it? Or will we keep charging forward, blind to the abyss ahead? I've spent my life studying war. And I can tell you the abyss is closer than you think. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't the first time Russia has drawn a map like this. In 2014, after the Maidan coup, Moscow annexed Crimea and backed separatists in Donetsk and Luhansk. The West called it an illegal land grab, but the reality was far more nuanced. The Minsk agreements signed by Ukraine, Russia, France, and Germany were supposed to grant those regions special status within Ukraine. But Kiev never implemented them. Why? Because the Ukrainian government, under pressure from hardline nationalists, refused to give an inch. And the West, rather than pushing for compromise, kept feeding the illusion that Ukraine could retake everything by force. Here's the uncomfortable: the West has been playing a dangerous game of brinkmanship for a decade. We armed Ukraine, trained its military, and encouraged its leaders to believe they could win a war against Russia. But we never asked the hard questions. Could Ukraine really hold the Donbass? Could it retake Crimea? And if not, what was the endgame? The answer, as we're seeing now, is that there was no endgame, just a slow-motion disaster. Let me explain why this matters. In 2022, when Russia launched its full-scale invasion, the Ukrainian military was stronger than ever. But it was also fighting a war it couldn't win. The Russians had superior firepower, deeper manpower reserves, and a willingness to absorb casualties that the West couldn't match. And yet, we kept pouring weapons into Ukraine, telling Zelensky to keep fighting, to never negotiate. Why? Because admitting defeat would mean admitting that our entire strategy was flawed. Now, I've heard the arguments. We can't let Russia win. We have to stand up to aggression. If we don't stop Putin in Ukraine, he'll keep going. But here's the: Russia isn't Nazi Germany. It's not an annexionist empire bent on world domination. It's a declining power with a shrinking population, a stagnant economy, and a military that's been stretched thin by this war. The real threat isn't that Russia will march on Warsaw or Berlin, it's that we'll keep feeding this conflict until it spirals out of control. Take the recent Russian offensive in Kharkiv. The Ukrainians were caught off guard, their lines collapsing in days. Why? Because they'd been starved of ammunition, their best troops were exhausted, and their Western backers were too busy arguing over aid packages to notice the storm coming. And yet, the narrative in the West is still that Ukraine can turn the tide if we just send more weapons. It's delusional. Here's another fact: most people, the Russian economy isn't collapsing. Despite sanctions, despite the war, Russia's GDP grew by 3.6% in 2023. Its defense industry is running at full capacity. Its currency is stable. And its population, while war-weary, is still largely supportive of the war effort. Meanwhile, Ukraine's economy has shrunk by a third, its infrastructure is in ruins, and its people are fleeing by the millions. The West keeps talking about winning, but the math doesn't add up. Now, I'm not saying we should just hand Ukraine over to Russia. But we need to be honest about what's possible. The idea that Ukraine can retake all its lost territory is a fantasy. The idea that NATO can force Russia to its knees is even more dangerous. And the idea that we can keep escalating without risking a wider war is the height of irresponsibility. Let me tell you something I learned: in the wars don't end when one side wins. They end when both sides decide they've had enough. The question is, how much more suffering will it take before we reach that point? How many more Ukrainian cities will be reduced to rubble? How many more Russian soldiers will die in the mud? And how close will we have to get to the nuclear brink before someone blinks? The Russians have made their demands clear. They want a neutral Ukraine, free of NATO influence, with the Donbass and Crimea under their control. The West calls this unacceptable. But what's the alternative? A forever war that bleeds Ukraine dry? A direct NATO-Russia conflict that could go nuclear? Or a negotiated settlement that, while painful, at least ends the killing? I've seen this movie before. In Afghanistan, in Iraq, in Vietnam. We keep thinking we can shape the world in our image, that our military might and economic power will always prevail. But history shows that's not how it works. Sometimes, the only way to win is to know when to stop fighting. The Russians have drawn their line. The question is whether we'll have the wisdom to respect it or the folly to cross it. And if we choose the latter, we'd better be prepared for the consequences. Because this isn't just about Ukraine anymore. It's about the future of the world order. And right now, that future is hanging by a thread. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about territory, it's about the fundamental balance of power in Europe, and whether we're willing to accept that the post-Cold War order is over. The Russians have been signaling this for years, not just with words but with actions. Remember 2008 in Georgia? The West dismissed it as a one-off. Then came Crimea in 2014, and we called it an illegal annexation while doing nothing meaningful to reverse it. Now, 8 years later, we're shocked that Moscow has decided to finish what it started. Let me explain why this matters beyond Ukraine's borders. The map Russia is drawing isn't just about Donetsk and Luhansk anymore. It's about creating a new security architecture in Europe, one where NATO's eastward action is permanently halted. The Kremlin has been clear since at least 2021 that it sees Ukraine's potential NATO membership as an existential threat. And while the West dismisses that as paranoia, the fact is that every major power in history has drawn red lines around its immediate periphery. The Monroe Doctrine wasn't just a suggestion, it was enforced, sometimes at gunpoint. The Soviets did the same in Eastern Europe after 1945. And now, Russia is doing it in its own backyard. Here's the uncomfortable: NATO's action wasn't just about spreading democracy. It was about consolidating US influence in Europe, and Russia's leadership has never been subtle about its opposition to that. In 2007, Putin gave a speech in Munich where he explicitly warned that NATO's eastward creep was a direct threat to Russian security. The West ignored him. In 2008, NATO declared that Ukraine and Georgia would eventually join the alliance. Russia invaded Georgia that same year. In 2014, after the Maidan Revolution, Russia annexed Crimea and backed separatists in the Donbass. The West imposed sanctions but kept pushing for Ukraine's NATO membership. And now, in 2024, we're surprised that Russia has decided to settle the matter by force? The military implications of this are even more sobering. The Russian military has taken heavy losses, no one disputes that. But it has also adapted in ways that should concern anyone who thinks this war can be won with more HIMARS and F-16s. The Russians have shifted to a grinding, attritional strategy, using massed artillery and drone warfare to wear down Ukrainian forces. They've also demonstrated a willingness to absorb casualties that would break most Western armies. In the Battle of Bakhmut, Russian forces took tens of thousands of casualties, some estimates put it at over 20,000 dead in a single city. And yet, they kept coming. That's not just about tactics, it's about a different approach to war, one where human life is expendable in a way that Western militaries, with their emphasis on force protection, can no longer stomach. Now, compare that to Ukraine's position. The Ukrainian military has fought with incredible bravery, but it's running out of men. The average age of a Ukrainian soldier is now over 40, and the country is scraping the bottom of the barrel for new recruits. The recent mobilization law, which lowers the conscription age to 25, is a sign of desperation, not strength. Meanwhile, Western aid is drying up. The US Congress has been deadlocked for months over additional funding, and Europe's industrial base simply can't produce enough artillery shells to keep Ukraine in the fight. The math is Russia is outproducing Ukraine in artillery by a factor of 5 to 1, and that gap is only widening. But the real danger isn't just that Ukraine is losing, it's that the West keeps pretending it can turn the tide with just a little more time and a little more money. That's the same delusion that kept us in Vietnam for a decade, in Iraq for nearly as long, and in Afghanistan for 20 years. The difference here is that Russia isn't some third-rate power. It's a nuclear-armed state with a population of 140 million, a massive industrial base, and a leadership that has shown it's willing to escalate if it feels cornered. Let me be, I'm not saying Russia is invincible. Its military has made mistakes, and its economy is under strain. But it's also true that the West has overestimated its own leverage. Sanctions have hurt Russia, but they haven't crippled it. The ruble is stable, inflation is under control, and Russia's defense industry is running at full capacity. Meanwhile, Europe is facing its own energy crisis, and the US is stretched thin by global commitments. The idea that we can outlast Russia in a prolonged war of attrition is wishful thinking. So where does that leave us? The most likely outcome is a frozen conflict, where Ukraine is forced to accept a de facto partition while the West saves face by calling it a temporary arrangement. That's what happened in Korea in 1953, in Cyprus in 1974, and in Georgia after 2008. The alternative, a direct NATO intervention, is unthinkable, because it would risk a nuclear exchange. And yet, the longer this war drags on, the greater the chance of miscalculation. A stray missile hitting NATO territory, a Ukrainian strike deep into Russian territory, a Russian decision to escalate with tactical nukes, any of these could spiral out of control. The question we should be asking isn't whether Ukraine can win. It's whether the West is prepared to accept that the world has changed, and that the old rules no longer apply. The post-Cold War era, where the US could dictate terms to the rest of the world, is over. Russia has made that clear. China is watching closely, and if we push too hard, Beijing may decide it's time to settle its own scores over Taiwan, over the South China Sea, over the future of Asia. I've spent my life studying war, and I can tell you the most dangerous moment in any conflict isn't when one side is winning. It's when both sides believe they can't afford to lose. That's where we are now. The Russians believe they're fighting for their survival. The Ukrainians believe they're fighting for their freedom. And the West believes it's fighting for the future of the liberal order. None of them can back down without losing everything. So what's the way out? It's not pretty. It involves acknowledging that Ukraine can't retake all its territory, that NATO's action has limits, and that Russia isn't going to disappear as a major power. It means negotiating a settlement that freezes the conflict, even if it leaves some Ukrainian territory under Russian control. And it means accepting that the alternative, a forever war, is far worse. The establishment won't like this. They'll call it appeasement. They'll say we're rewarding aggression. But the reality is that we've been rewarding aggression for years, by ignoring Russia's warnings, by extending NATO right up to its borders, by pretending that military power alone can solve every problem. The time for that kind of thinking is over. The Russians have drawn their map. The question is whether we'll have the wisdom to read it or the arrogance to ignore it. And if we choose the latter, we'd better be ready for a world where the rules of the game have changed, and not in our favor. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Ukraine. It's about the unraveling of an entire domestic political consensus in the West, one that has been crumbling for years but is now accelerating at a pace that should alarm anyone paying attention. Let me explain why this matters. In Washington, the foreign policy establishment has spent the last 3 decades operating under a set of assumptions that no longer hold. They believed that economic interdependence would tame Russia, that NATO action was cost-free, and that military power could be wielded with surgical precision. None of that turned out to be true. And yet, the same people who got us into this mess are still in charge, still insisting that the only acceptable outcome is a Ukrainian victory, whatever that means. The problem is, the American people aren't buying it anymore. Look at the polling. In 2022, nearly 60% of Americans supported sending weapons to Ukraine. By early 2024, that number had dropped to around 40%. Among Republicans, support has collapsed, only 30% now back continued aid, down from 60% 2 years ago. Even Democrats, traditionally more hawkish on foreign interventions, are wavering. Why? Because the war isn't abstract anymore. It's inflation, it's empty weapon stockpiles, it's the growing sense that we're being asked to write blank checks for a conflict with no clear endgame. Here's the uncomfortable: the American public is ahead of its leaders on this. They see what the establishment refuses to admit, that we're not just fighting Russia in Ukraine, we're fighting a proxy war against a nuclear-armed power that has made it clear it will not accept defeat. And they're asking a simple "what's the plan?" The answer, so far, has been silence. Now, let's talk about Europe. The continent is facing its own political earthquake, and Ukraine is at the center of it. In Germany, the AfD, once a fringe party, is now polling at 20%, largely on the back of opposition to the war and the economic pain it's caused. In France, Marine Le Pen's national rally is surging, with her anti-NATO, pro-dialogue stance resonating with voters tired of being dragged into a conflict they never signed up for. Even in Poland, the government that once positioned itself as Ukraine's staunchest ally is now facing backlash over grain imports and the strain of hosting millions of refugees. The European political class is in denial. They still talk about strategic autonomy and European defense, but the reality is that Europe is more dependent on the US than ever, and the US is running out of patience. The recent NATO summit in Washington was a masterclass in cognitive dissonance. Leaders gave soaring speeches about unity and resolve, but behind the. So where does this leave us? Let's game out the scenarios. The first, and most likely, is a frozen conflict. Russia consolidates its gains in the east and south, Ukraine is left with a rump state heavily dependent on Western aid, and the front lines harden into a new Iron Curtain. This isn't a win for anyone, but it's the least bad option. The alternative is a prolonged war of attrition, where Ukraine slowly bleeds out while the West scrambles to keep it afloat. That path leads to one of two: either Ukraine collapses, or the West is forced into a humiliating retreat after years of wasted resources and lives. The second scenario is escalation. If Ukraine's position becomes truly desperate, there's a real risk that NATO countries, particularly Poland or the Baltics, could be drawn in directly. I've heard whispers in Washington about limited airstrikes or even the deployment of Western troops under the guise of training missions. That's a recipe for disaster. The Russians have made it clear that any direct NATO involvement would trigger a response, and they have the tactical nukes to back that up. We're playing with fire, and the establishment seems determined to keep striking matches. The third scenario is the most: a negotiated settlement that no one wants to admit is a surrender. This would involve Ukraine ceding territory in exchange for security guarantees and a path to EU membership. It's not pretty, but it's the only way to avoid a catastrophic collapse. The problem is that neither side is ready to make the concessions required. Zelensky's government is still clinging to the fantasy of total victory, while Putin's regime has staked its legitimacy on the idea that Russia is reclaiming its historic lands. Neither man can afford to back down without risking his own political survival. Now, let's talk about the domestic political fallout in the US. The 2024 election is shaping up to be a referendum on this war. Trump has made it clear that if he wins, he'll push for a rapid negotiated settlement. Biden, on the other hand, is doubling down, insisting that Ukraine must win even as his own military warns that the cupboard is bare. The irony is that Biden's position is more hawkish than many in his own party. Progressive Democrats are increasingly vocal about the need for diplomacy, and even some Republicans, like J.D. Vance, are breaking ranks to question the endless flow of aid. Here's what no one in Washington wants: to the American people are exhausted. They're tired of wars that never end, tired of being told that they have to care about conflicts halfway across the world, tired of watching their tax dollars disappear into a black hole of corruption and inefficiency. The establishment calls this isolationism. I call it common sense. The real question is whether the political class will listen. History suggests they won't. The foreign policy blob has a remarkable ability to ignore reality until it's too late. We saw this in Vietnam, in Iraq, in Afghanistan. Each time, the warning signs were there, but the people in charge refused to see them until the bodies started coming home. This time, the stakes are even higher. Because this isn't just about Ukraine. It's about the future of the international order. If we keep pushing Russia into a corner, if we keep pretending that military power alone can solve every problem, we're going to wake up one day in a world where the rules have been rewritten, and not by us. The Russians have drawn their map. The Chinese are watching. The American people are losing patience. The only question left is whether our leaders will have the courage to admit that the game has changed, or whether they'll keep playing by the old rules until it's too late. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just a foreign policy debate, it's a domestic power struggle in slow motion. The Biden administration has tied its entire legacy to the idea that America can and must shape the world in its image, even when the world is actively resisting that shaping. But here's the uncomfortable: the American people aren't buying it anymore. And the numbers don't lie. Take a look at the polling. A Pew Research survey from March 2024 found that 55% of Americans now believe the U.S. is providing too much aid to Ukraine. That's up from 44% just a year earlier. Among Republicans, the number is even starker: 71% say we're doing too much. Even Democrats are split, with 38% saying we've gone far enough. These aren't fringe opinions. This is the mainstream. And yet, the political class acts as if the only acceptable position is full-throated, unconditional support for Kyiv, no matter the cost. Let me explain why this matters. When you have a disconnect this wide between the people and their leaders, you don't just get policy failures, you get political earthquakes. We saw this in 2016 with Trump's election, which was, at its core, a rejection of the bipartisan consensus on globalization and interventionism. We're seeing it again now, but this time, the rebellion isn't just coming from the right. Progressive Democrats like Ro Khanna and Ilhan Omar have been vocal about the need to rein in military spending and push for negotiations. Even some of the old guard are starting to break ranks. Senator Dick Durbin, the number 2 Democrat in the Senate, recently admitted that the U.S. can't keep funding Ukraine indefinitely. That's not isolationism, that's arithmetic. The problem is that the establishment still doesn't get it. They're stuck in the post-Cold War mindset, where America's unipolar moment was supposed to last forever. They see every challenge to that order as an existential threat, whether it's Russia in Ukraine or China in the South China Sea. But the world has changed. The U.S. no longer has the economic or military dominance it once did. Our debt-to-GDP ratio is over 120%, our industrial base is hollowed out, and our military is stretched thin. Meanwhile, our adversaries are playing a different game. Russia is willing to absorb staggering losses to secure its strategic objectives. China is patiently building its own economic and military ecosystem, one that doesn't rely on the West. And the global South? They're hedging their bets, playing both sides, because they know the old rules don't apply anymore. Here's the scenario that keeps me up at night. The Biden administration, desperate to avoid a humiliating defeat before the election, doubles down on escalation. They send more long-range missiles, they push for NATO involvement, they even hint at direct strikes on Russian soil. The Russians, in turn, respond by hitting back harder, maybe not with nukes, but with something just as a full-scale mobilization of their economy and society for total war. Suddenly, we're not just funding a proxy fight in Ukraine. We're in a direct confrontation with a nuclear-armed power that has nothing left to lose. And what happens then? The American people, already exhausted, revolt. The progressive left and the populist right find common ground in opposing the war. Congress, facing a backlash, cuts off funding. The Ukrainians, abandoned, are forced to accept whatever terms Moscow offers. The Russians, having secured their buffer zones, declare victory. And the world? It learns a dangerous that the U.S. can be outlasted, outmaneuvered, and ultimately defeated. That's the best-case scenario. The worst-case scenario is that we stumble into a wider war, one that pulls in NATO, that triggers a global economic meltdown, that leaves millions dead. And for what? To preserve the illusion of American hegemony? To prove that we can still dictate the terms of the international order? I've been in rooms where these decisions are made. I've seen the hubris, the groupthink, the refusal to consider that maybe, just maybe, the other side might have a pull. The establishment will tell you that any retreat from Ukraine is a surrender to tyranny, that any negotiation is appeasement. But history tells a different story. In 1962, during the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy and Khrushchev stared into the abyss and pulled back. They negotiated. They compromised. And they saved the world from nuclear war. That's not weakness, that's statesmanship. The Russians have drawn their map. The question now is whether we have the wisdom to accept that the world has changed, or whether we'll keep charging forward until the ground gives way beneath us. The American people are ready for a different path. The only question is whether our leaders will listen or whether they'll keep leading us toward the cliff.